Thank you very much, those of you that are willing to stay 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Congratulations to you. You're going to be rewarded. You're going to be rewarded. I will probably surprise you in this one. Instead of being the usual idiot that I am, I may be a little more serious. May not be, but I may well be. Because the topic is one that's very interesting for lawyers. I hardly know how to begin except to say that last year, our Centerville bunch, the ones that we refer to every year as the Centerville bunch from Centerville, Tennessee, consisting in the middle there, Doug Bates, but one of his buddies from Centerville, who is here today, Austin Vanderhorst, suggested a program on ethics. And whenever somebody suggests a program on ethics to me, what do? I try to be nice. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking what? The program you have in mind is not going to be interactive enough. It is not going to be engaging enough for those in attendance. And I do not want to bore people. I do not want to, although I do from time to time, I do not want to bore people at our seminar. And they told me that Doug, after we talked a while, Doug told me what he had in mind, and it involved some talking. And I'm thinking like, okay, Doug, I love you, Doug, but we're going to have to do this a little bit differently. We're going to have to make it a little bit more interactive. And then we did our first program in Jackson, Tennessee, and I told myself, Joe, you were wrong. You missed it. Doug has something to say, and if Joe will shut up, it will be very well received. This is our fourth stop with this particular program. I can brag because I'm not really much of a part in it. It has received rave reviews, and if you don't think it deserves it, let us hear from you in that regard. It is different. It is going to require you, if you want to play along, to engage your mind and think about your profession. And we're going to go back some 50 years in time and talk about a couple of lawyers or more. We are filming for the Rhodes College Crossroads to Freedom Digital Archive Project, preserving stories of World War II soldiers, and copies of this presentation today will be donated to the Tennessee Bar Association and also to the Supreme Court Historical Collection. Doug Bates, who comes every year, who's done this program across the state. He will not take any expense money. And we are, in case you haven't noticed, we are a for-profit partnership. And we are 3 equal partners, by the way. This is not the John Day Enterprise, Inc. This is John and Penny and Joe. Doug Bates from Centerville.
I feel a part of this group. We come, my son and my beloved friends Austin and Dana come every year. We celebrate Memphis in our off time. And I look at your faces and I do not know your names, but I know your faces, and I'm happy to see you again. And I'm going to say right now, I appreciate very much you hanging around to listen to this. I'm well aware of the challenge I face. I know it is Friday before Christmas. And I know you have been here at this seminar for several hours, and you're ready to go home. By the way, I especially appreciate my Memphis friends who are getting no CLE for coming, but are just here because they are our friends. Most of you come to this seminar because of the sparkling presentations that you get, full of humor and good cheer. I am not as capable of humor and good cheer as the three partners, but I'm capable of humor and good cheer. But alas, this topic does not lend itself to that. And I am sorry that I must be somewhat ponderous. I hope, if you allow me, I can convince you that this war crime trial, which took place in Germany 70 years almost to the day ago, has relevance in your life. I'll let the cat out of the bag and tell you the story briefly. There once was an artillery officer in the United States Army who fought his way across France and Germany from D-Day until after the Battle of the Bulge. And after the war was over, he was not allowed to go home, but was assigned to war crimes investigation. And while he was doing that work, was ordered to be the chief defense counsel at the Dachau war crime trials, where he defended 40 SS people. That soldier, who was ordered after the war to defend his enemy, had been to Cumberland 1 year and got his law degree. That soldier was from Centerville, Tennessee, and that soldier was my father. I do not intend for this to be a presentation of here's what my dad did during the war. I'm a little sensitive about taking your time telling you about my dad. I would love to hear about all of your fathers, many of whom defended our nation in war. Though he was in combat, and the combat is relevant to this story, I am not raising him up as any combat hero. We all know of that generation of Americans. They did not claim hero status. They did their duty and came home and did their duty. Unlike most seminars we go to, this is not the story of a great legal victory. It is the story of a crushing legal defeat. It is a soldier story. It is a lawyer story. But I think it is best understood in another context. Do you remember the opening of that television series, Dr. Ben Casey? When old Dr. Zorba would say to Ben Casey, "A doctor is a human being, Ben Casey. A lawyer is a human being." And though I am talking to lawyers, primarily, I'm talking to human beings. In order to tell you about the human being story, I must tell you some things about that lawyer from Centerville who fought his way across France and Germany and who was my dad. After J.A. Bates survived the Battle of Franklin and the Battle of Nashville, he paroled out of the Confederate Army, came back home to Centerville, where he had two sons, Connor Bates, a lawyer, and Douglas Bates I, a lawyer. One July afternoon, a little 6-year-old boy was sitting on the rock wall when his Aunt Florence Tucker came down to talk to his mother. And that little 6-year-old boy remembers his mother's screams. And she was screaming because Douglas Bates I had been killed in the great train wreck of Dutchman's Curve in Nashville in 1919. Ms. Bates had 4 children, including my dad, the little 6-year-old boy, and one on the way. It turned out to be J.A. Bates, who I'll tell you right now, he ended up being a Marine pilot, flying B-25s in the Pacific. The Depression hit that fatherless family pretty hard. And my dad, after thinking maybe I could go to Vanderbilt and play football and get a scholarship, and he wasn't good enough, so he stayed there a semester and came back home. And he had 2 lost years. And then John Wilson was doing some title work over in the Register of Deeds office in Hickman County and found that Ms. Bates owned some timberland that she didn't know about. He contacted her, and that timberland was sold, and with that money, Daddy went to Cumberland for 1 year, which is all you had to go back in those days. He got out of law school and began practicing law with that title lawyer, John Wilson. And they practiced law in 36, 37, 38, and 39, and they did not make a living. My dad felt like he was a failure. And I break the narrative for just a second to say we should be mindful of that. These are hard times for young lawyers. We've talked about it these last 2 days. And we should recognize that many of them think they are failures. They are not failures. The times are hard. But Daddy thought he was a failure, and he thought that he had let down his family name. In order to supplement his income, he joined the National Guard, which was an artillery unit there in Centerville, and that he was pretty good in math. And so became a gunnery instructor at Fort Sill. His unit was activated and he was sent to Germany, or to France, where D+11, he landed at Normandy, and fought his way across France and Germany and slept in the field for 10 months. I tell you this not that he's a combat man, but I wanted you to know what was certainly on his mind when he was trying that case. His unit was in combat for 242 days. Some of you have seen combat. I have in Vietnam, but nothing like that. Nothing like day after day after day. His unit fired 73,062 .105 howitzer rounds during that time, averaging 304 rounds a day. We forget that the American Army was up against a stubborn and skilled enemy. The war, they did not just lie down after D-Day. When this trial was taking place, Daddy was only weeks away from being in combat. Think about this. Have you ever had this experience? You call another lawyer and you say, could we set those depositions next Thursday? No, we can't. I will have just completed a 2-day trial the week before, and I'll still be tired. Colonel Bates, we're going to try that case in November and December. No, I've just been fighting a war for 11 months. I'm tired. And of course, we know that the word after combat is not tired. But that was the circumstances that this trial took place. After the Battle of the Bulge, Daddy was pulled out of his unit and was assigned to war crimes investigation. And it was while he was doing that investigating that he was pulled out of that to be the chief defense counsel of the men charged with committing those crimes. I want to say right now one word or two words about my dad personally. One is, sometimes in his latter life, people would hear that he had defended Germans at war crime trials, and they would frisk up to him and say, you know, I've always had real questions about whether those things took place. And my dad would explode. Don't tell me they didn't take place. I saw it. I want to tell you something happened in 1967 that I didn't process until years later. In the 1967 Israeli war, my dad went down to the local radio station. Do you remember those teletypes that would come in with the news and the yellow sheets? And Daddy would sit there in that teletype room and read those accounts of the Israeli victories. And I now know exactly why he was so gleeful. My father did not have an anti-Semitic drop of blood in his body. And he was defending people who were eaten up with anti-Semitism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the crimes here. Surely you know about the crimes. The most effective way to put this on, which I have participated in, a fellow named Joshua Green wrote a book about the Dachau war crime trials. And he has a seminar that he puts on, and the night before, he shows a documentary of survivors of the concentration camps telling what they have been through. And you can hardly stand to listen to them. And then the next day, you talk about the trial. And I argue that those people should have gotten a fair trial. Suffice it to say that when the Dachau camp was liberated, there were boxcar after boxcar after boxcar full to the top of the bodies of dead human beings who had died of starvation at Dachau. Why did they choose an American lawyer? Remember, Dachau was before Nuremberg. And at that time, they were having a difficult time getting German lawyers to represent German defendants. Anybody have any question about why that was? Those German lawyers didn't want to be a part of the old order. Why did they choose my dad, which was a question that was asked in Knoxville? I have no earthly idea. He was an artillery officer. He was a country lawyer that had gone 1 year to Cumberland. He had not been successful as a lawyer, but he was chosen to walk on the world stage as the chief defense counsel of the Dachau war crime trials, the first American war crime trial. How did he feel about it? in your material, by the way, you notice I don't have any PowerPoints. I want to look right in your eyes. How do you feel about it? There's a letter in your materials that he wrote my mother. And in it he says, Kitty, let there be no question about it that I was ordered to do this over my protest. He warned my mother of the press that would be against them. And then he warned my mother that these were infamous people, but he was going to do the best he could representing them because that's just the way he was. I'm now ready to introduce you to Bill Denson, the prosecutor. And I never met Bill Denson. I met his wife, his widow, and from everything I hear about him, he was a wonderful man. But there were some differences. Like my dad, he was the son of a lawyer, but he was the son of a very prominent lawyer in Birmingham and went to Harvard undergraduate school and law school. During the war, while Daddy was sleeping in the mud, shooting at Germans and getting shot at, Bill Denson was teaching at West Point. My father was crushed that he didn't get to come home after the war but had to defend 40 Germans. Bill Denson was thrilled to get the assignment because he thought it would set the stage for him to have a career as an international lawyer. Daddy wanted to come home in Centerville and see if he could make a living. Bill Denson wanted to be an international lawyer. The story of those two men is full of ironies. Some of them you've already picked up on. My dad fought the Germans. Bill Denson never saw a moment of combat or, in the words we're familiar with, heard a shot fired in anger. Here's some irony for you. While Bill Denson was prosecuting those Nazis at Dachau for war crimes, he met and fell in love with a German lady named Effie. And Effie was a survivor of the Dresden firebombings. I don't intend to get off on a tangent, but there is some legitimate questions about whether the Dresden firebombing had any tactical significance at all, or was merely just dropping bombs on civilian populations in Germany. Both men came from families of lawyers. Both men were of deep religious faith. Both men came from a Confederate heritage. They both, family had lost a war. And both men lost. My dad listened to 36 out of 40 of his clients sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Daddy lost a crushing defeat at the trial. Bill Denson lived to see many of his hard-won convictions reversed because we were trying to curry favor with the West Germans, and therefore commuted and let go free many of those who were convicted. They both were bitter over the experience. When Daddy mustered out at Camp Adelberry, he saw that his commission did not say artillery, but it said Judge Advocate General. And he spent years and political influence just getting a new commission issued so it didn't say JAG on it. Bill Denson was so furious at those convictions being reversed that when he came back, he was first in the Army National Guard, and then he got out of the Army National Guard and got in the Air Force National Guard so he wouldn't have any part of that. They both carried pain with them, and yet they never saw each other or spoke to each other ever again. They both were fishermen. I've wondered how much healing they could have been to each other if Bill Denson had come down to Hickman County and fished in Swan Creek or the Piney River together, or if Daddy had gone to the Catskills and fished with Bill Denson. Well, I want to say a word about the trial, and I'm not going to go into great detail about the trial. When we were in Knoxville, we ran into a couple of JAG officers that were very interested in the thing, and they had some fascinating things to say, and I don't have time to get into them, but I am going to talk to you lawyers about the trial. Now, as I tell you about the rules that the trial was tried under, remember that my dad had a year of law school and he had nothing in his legal career to make him think he was a great lawyer. As a matter of fact, those hard years made him think he probably wasn't a very good lawyer. But you think back how it was in your early career, and you're trying to marry up what you learned in law school to the way the trial's going. All right? The charge was made up out of whole cloth by the prosecutor. No grand jury, no convening authority. The prosecutor made up the charge. Here it was. Participation in a common design to commit cruelties and mistreatments. Bingo. Sounds a little like conspiracy, doesn't it? By the way, remember, conspiracy in common law is a misdemeanor. Conspiracy, Daddy would have learned over in the law barn in Cumberland. He would have learned that conspiracy requires a culpable mens rea. Specifically, the rules that were drawn up required 0 mens rea. What he would have learned is that you have to have the culpable mens rea, and you have to know that your co-conspirator had a mens rea, a culpable mens rea. Didn't have either requirement. It may sound a little like criminal participation, which you may have some knowledge of, which some of you old guys, and boy, we got a bunch of them here, Joe. Some of you old guys remember accessories in the first degree and accessories in the second degree. But still, it was necessary to prove a culpable mens rea. Not here. Specifically, the substantive law was that it was not a defense, that the act complained of was legal at the time it was done. Now, 40 defendants were chosen by the prosecutor to stand trial. All of them worked at the Dachau work camp. Here they were. 9 camp officers, 3 office clerks, 1 labor office, 5 medical officers, 2 hospital orderlies, 3 block leaders, 1 head of the political department, 1 adjunct, 1 officer of the guard, 1 supply officer, and 3 guards at the gates. And they were all to be tried together. Now, I know what you would do. You'd say, if you were in federal court, you'd file a Rule 8 motion and try to get them severed. If you were in state court, you'd file a Rule 15 and try to get them severed. No. All tried together. What is the What's the pattern of these people that were joined? They wished to establish the principle that if you did anything at that camp, you were guilty of everything. It was a principle that they wished to establish for subsequent war crime trials. Remember, this was our first. You wouldn't need Penny White to teach you about evidence of that case, because the evidence was codified in the following way. Anything which might seem reasonable to a reasonable man was admissible. Hearsay was specifically said admissible, and so a lot of the proof was on affidavits. The prosecution did not have to prove that there was cruelties and mistreatments. The court took judicial notice of the crimes that they were alleged that had taken place. And the burden was on the defendant to show that he did not participate. Exactly opposite. Once, when my dad made a proposition to the court about the rights of the accused, the court reminded my father that his clients were not American citizens and they were not entitled to the rights of the accused as set forth in the Bill of Rights. And in a moment of reckless abandon, my dad said, and was quoted in some hometown papers, or American papers, Madison only wrote those rights. God gave them. Let's pause for a second and remember back. We've all had the experience of being in a court where you feel like you're in Alice in Wonderland, where the Queen of Hearts gets to say what's what. As you get older, you roll with the punches a little better, don't you? You understand, well, these things happen. But when you're younger, you thought the way they taught you in law school is the way it was going to be. And when you were trying a case with a huge American flag behind the court, you thought American rights applied. Well, as Joe points out when we do these things, there wasn't much defense. But the defense team mounted a defense. And we know the defense because we have some of Colonel Bates's words in his closing argument. One of his defenses were, they were only following orders. And he pointed out, why am I speaking on behalf of these defendants? Because I'm following orders. And you are trying to convict these people who were only following orders. I step back and say, it's a Friday before Christmas, and we don't have time to get into the interesting question of natural rights versus men's rights. I understand that these crimes were so horrible that maybe no defense should have been done, but they would set it up as a trial. But that was one of the defenses, only following orders. The most overarching defense my dad had, which he talked about frequently during the rest of his life, including the last day he was alive, is his position was, when the surrender is over, stop the killing. Here's the way he put it. If we want to shoot Germans as a matter of policy, let it be done as such but do not hide those deeds behind a court. He raised the defense of necessity. Here's the way he put it in his closing argument. Germany had lost the war. Their fields were laid bare. They had no food. A new definition of murder has come up. I am supposed to feed the prisoners. I have no food for the prisoners. Therefore, I have killed them. Perhaps the commandant of Dachau should have replicated the miracle of Galilee and turned 3 fish and 5 loaves into food enough to feed them all. He raised the defense of how far shall we go? Here were his words. If every one of these defendants is guilty of participating in a large common design, then it becomes necessary to hold responsible every member of the Nazi Party and every citizen of Germany who contributed to the waging of total war. If I have time, I'll come back to that. He raised a bold defense. How innocent are we? Now, when I read my dad's words, a lot of times I can't imagine how he gave them, but I know exactly what he did on this one. Bill Denson was from Birmingham, Alabama. And when my dad said these words, I am sure he looked right at that Alabama lawyer and said these words. Lynch law, of which we know something about in America, often gets the right man, but in its wake is bred a contempt for the law. He went on, and his last words in his closing argument was, the rule of law in the final analysis is the surest defense against Nazism in all its forms. He pillared the prosecution for referring to the defendants as beasts. In his argument, he said, may I pause here and ask, is it necessary for me to remind the court that these defendants are men and not beasts? Accusing the prosecution of exactly what the Germans did to those prisoners, forgetting they were human beings and treating them as beasts. He spoke of beatings in state prisons. And interestingly, and perhaps somewhat prophetically, he said that there were medical investigations and experiments going on in our own prisons. I frankly don't know whether he had any data to back him up on that at that time in 1945, but we know now it did happen. Well, the court retired and deliberated for less than 12 hours and announced their verdict. I found a document that had typewritten the names of the defendants on them and had some of my dad's handwriting. Do you know how when a jury comes out, you get a tablet and you get a pen and you start writing what the jury did? As if you can't remember what the jury did, but it's just something to do while that jury is announcing those verdicts. I have never had this experience. Perhaps some of y'all have had it. I've talked to 2 lawyers who have had the experience. of a jury coming back and finding a defendant guilty of first-degree murder and recommending the death penalty. And those two lawyers I've talked to said they have never gotten over it. Here is a typewritten page that I have in my things at home, and my dad's writing is on it. And he has written 36 times H. So we heard Martin Gottfried Weiss, hanged. Frederick Wilhelm Rupert, hanged. Joseph Jared Jolin, hanged. Franz Trinkel, H, 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 life. H, 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 10 years. H, 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 10 years. H, 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 10 years. H, 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 H. In those papers, there was also a typewritten list of the members of the court. And on the back of that sheet, my dad had written in his own handwriting, "Here is the court that convicted 40 defendants with no evidence." It's in your page papers. There is a picture of my dad making his closing argument that someone took. And on the back of that little picture, in my dad's own handwriting, he wrote, "Futile closing argument." A year earlier, he was lobbing 105 shells into their position. 6 months earlier, he was protesting against being ordered to defend them. And here is the way he felt when those verdicts came in. 16 December 1945. In a letter to Mother. Thursday was a day I'll never forget, though I would very much like to. 36 of the 40 defendants were sentenced to death. It shocked everyone. One cannot work night and day with 40 men for 6 weeks without having a feeling of comradeship. The happenings of Thursday tore my heart completely out. After the court adjourned, the defendants filed by, shaking our hands, thanking us for the fight, telling us Americans they could not have had a better defense anywhere. God, Kitty, can my heart stand any more? He goes on to say, a German newspaper man comes up to him and says, "Colonel, we watch, we see how moved you are by the verdict. The German people admire you a great deal." Futile closing argument. Daddy, what did you expect? Fight we had lost. Daddy, you were part of the United States Army. You won the war. You had lost feelings of comradeship with these defendants. God, Kitty, can my heart stand any more? What in the world is happening here? Why was he so hurt over losing an impossible case? Was he having self-doubts which began in those 4 years that he was a failure as a lawyer, and were they surfacing? Did he feel betrayed when he was told this would be a real trial? And it turned out it bared no similarity to anything any American lawyer or judge had ever heard. Did it rankle him that the Harvard lawyer who had seen no combat got the glorious victory? And he, from Little Cumberland and Little Centerville, Tennessee, but who had fought the Germans valiantly, got the defeat. Had he become convinced of their innocence? And had he come to identify with them because he was doing a task he did not wish to do because he was under orders just like they were? Was the stress of combat still weighing heavy in his heart? Had he gotten too close to his clients or too close to their issues? How did he go from the letter to mother saying, I hate this task, I don't want this task, to the letter to mother that said, the events of yesterday tore my heart completely out? I have two thoughts. Justice Robert Jackson, of course, was the chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg war crimes trial. And Justice Jackson was from Jamestown, New York, in western New York, near where my wife is from. And Jamestown is a small town. Justice Jackson wrote an essay about the country lawyer. And with your indulgence, I'd like to read you a part of it and see if you think this gives you some insight to how that country lawyer from Centerville could have gone from one extreme with the first letter to mother to the second letter, and see if you've known anybody like this. This vanishing country lawyer left his mark on his times, and he was worth knowing. Once enlisted for a client, he took his obligations seriously. He insisted on complete control of the litigation. He was by no means a hired hand. He gave every power and resource to the cause. He identified himself with the client's cause fully, sometimes too fully. He would fight the adverse party and fight his counsel, fight every hostile witness and fight the court, fight public sentiment, fight any obstacle to his client's success, and he never quit. He could think of motions for every purpose under the sun and made them all. He moved for new trials, he appealed, and if he lost in the end, he joined his client in the tavern, damning the judge. But his love for his profession, he had a real sense of dedication to the administration of justice. He held his head high as a lawyer. He rendered and extracted courtesy, honor, and straightforwardness at the bar. He respected the judicial office deeply and demanded of it the highest standards of competence and disinterestedness. He despised all political or trifling use of judicial power, but had an affectionate disregard for those judges who agreed with him. The law to him was like a religion, and his practice was more than a means of support. It was a mission. He was not always popular in his community, but he was respected. Unpopular minorities and individuals often found in him their only mediator and advocate. He was too independent to court the populace. He thought of himself as a leader and lawgiver, not as a mouthpiece. He lived well, worked hard, and died poor. Often his name was in a generation or two forgotten. It was from this brotherhood that America has drawn its statesmen and its judges. A true and free and self-governing republic stands as a monument for the little known and unremembered, as well as the famous men of our profession And so General Truscott perhaps made the mistake of appointing a country lawyer as the defense counsel. Surely, as I have presented this, it has occurred to you that I have not just been talking about my father. I have also been talking about you. You have not defended Nazis, but you have defended bad people. You have worked hard and failed. You have turned a case while something else was on your mind. You have grown to identify with your clients and their issues too much. Perhaps, perhaps not. Perhaps. You have wondered what you did wrong or what you failed to do. You have doubted the integrity of the system, and you have felt betrayed by it. And you have lost when you had no chance of winning. And still, it broke your heart. After D-Day, the Americans trapped the 7th German Army in the Falaise Gap, and they pounded them unmercifully, even after the German general tried to surrender his entire army. My dad's shells were in that pounding. Daddy went through the Falaise Gap to see what effect he had done. On Christmas Eve, after those verdicts came in, Daddy was still suffering, and he got a bag of candy and he walked out in the streets of Nuremberg, and he found a house with some lights on. And he knocked on the door, and an old couple came to the door. And they were back in their kitchen eating tea cakes and having tea, and they invited the American soldier to come in. And they shared the tea cakes with him and shared the tea, and after that, they ushered him down into the earthen basement where they went back into a hole and pulled out an electric train and set up that electric train. They had no electricity, but they just set it up, that old German couple and that American soldier. Daddy told me that story. He didn't tell me what his thoughts were. I've wondered. I've wondered if he wondered if that German couple lost a son or a nephew or a brother in the Falaise Gap. I wonder if Daddy looked at that old German couple and wondered what was their guilt in these horrible crimes that had taken place in Germany. Or I wonder if it was just this. That old German couple began the healing process for Colonel Bates. And I suspect that we could go around this room and tell of stories of the healing process after some of our defeats. Edward Arlington Robinson wrote a poem called Man Against the Sky. The setting of the poem is there's a hill, and the poet looks up on the hill, and there's a solitary man building a fire outlined against the sky. And the poet thinks he is building that fire to oppose the sky. And among his ramblings are these lines about that man against the sky. Whatever the dark road he may have taken, this man who stood on high and faced alone the sky, he may have stumbled up there from the past and with an aching strangeness viewed the last. And at his heart there may have gnawed sick memories of a dead faith, foiled and flawed. Whatever stayed him or derided him, his way was even as ours. And we, with all our wounds and all our powers, must each await alone at his own height another darkness or another light. And so, I thank you for listening. More than that, I thank you for understanding. And I salute my dad, and I salute all of you who have lost.